Support comes from the St. Louis Chamber Chorus. Season 68 concludes at John Burroughs at 3 p.m. on May 26th with the United Nations commissioned Voices of Today by composer Benjamin Britten, featuring youth and adult singers. Tickets at chamberchorus.org.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Last week marked the end of a raucous and chaotic session of the Missouri General Assembly. And while dissension among Missouri Republicans continued to be a major storyline, perhaps the biggest development in the final days was how Missouri Democrats killed off an effort to make the state constitution harder to amend. We have a lot to break down. So joining us today is Sarah Kellogg, St. Louis Public Radio's Statehouse and Politics reporter. Sarah, welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Hi, Jason. Good to be here.
What do you think was the biggest story during the 2024 legislative session? The things that actually passed are the bitter infighting among Missouri Republicans.
So I'm going to throw you an option C here, actually, which is that I'm surprised that the infighting didn't lead to a special session and that the legislature was able to get the things done that it had to get done, mainly the budget and the federal reimbursement allowance, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You know, at times I wasn't sure those were going to happen. The budget alone was a big indication of how this year went, honestly. I've only covered 4 sessions, one being back in 2018, but I have never seen the budget process go this way. It went to the Senate late, and it was in the Senate the day before the budget was due. There was no time for a Senate and House conference committee, which made this year's budget process really not as transparent as it could have been. And no one saw the final product until the day before. There were even concerns from Governor Parson about this. So, you know, we made the deadline, but woof, I think that ultimately the infighting, the fact that some stuff was able to get done is probably the bigger story.
So we'll get to the drama in a little bit because you and I both know that we love drama.
Yes, we do.
But it would be a stretch to say that lawmakers didn't do anything significant in the final week of the session. What were some of the things that made it across the finish line in the last 5 days that you'd like to highlight?
So, yeah, the federal reimbursement allowance, also known as the FRA. The FRA, it is a tax on healthcare providers. Basically, they pay this tax and they get reimbursed, then some, by the federal government. It pays for roughly a third of the state's Medicaid program. We're talking billions of dollars. This is a huge deal. And it was a huge point of contention 3 years ago, yes, when it was up for reauthorization. It had to go to a special session. So that was the big question this year, was whether or not it had to go to special session. It passed the final week. The House members didn't waste any time after it was delayed in the Senate. They took it up and passed it. So I think that is arguably the biggest non-budget thing that they were able to pass. Other things include a tax fix on property tax freezes for seniors. The way that the bill was drafted last year, it excluded people who were on pensions versus just Social Security. So it basically says if you're 62 and your county is participating in that program, you will qualify for a property tax freeze. There was a really big property rights bill that included a land bank for St. Louis County. It basically banned eviction moratoriums. There was an expansive public safety bill, which included a conviction review unit and also making it illegal to kind of shoot your firearm in the just up in the air, called celebratory gunfire. So there was a lot done this year. It was, but definitely not as much as other years for sure.
And could you elaborate on the land bank issue? Because I know that could be pretty important for St. Louis County.
Yeah, so land banks allow for public entities to acquire, manage, and develop vacant or abandoned or foreclosed property. So like a lot of abandoned buildings that you see, they could be basically taken and then redeveloped in that way. So that's huge for St. Louis County, as well as just other areas. It opens it to the state as a whole. So that's definitely one of, I know that Representative Kevin Windham, who's a Democrat from St. Louis County, that he was so excited for that one. And that was a huge win for him. And I think others in that area for sure.
Yeah, I actually talked with Representative Windham right after that passed, and people were congratulating him, and I wondered what he was being congratulated for. Maybe he had gotten like a doctorate in something, but it was to congratulate him on the land bank bill.
Yeah, absolutely.
But one of the things that's really notable here is the Senate didn't end up passing a single bill during the past week, primarily because Democrats were engaging in a record-setting filibuster over a measure making it harder to amend the Missouri Constitution. And you could tell after his chamber adjourned that House Speaker Dean Plocher was not particularly pleased with what happened.
We may have our disagreements, we talk them through, but on the other side of the building, it's like having the door closed and mom and dad are screaming at each other. That doesn't help the family.
That's House Speaker Dean Plocher, a Republican from Des Peres. So, Sarah, does Plocher have a right to be annoyed that the Senate melted down too much this year?
I don't know how he could have seen what has happened the last couple of sessions and not think that the same thing wasn't possible this year. I'm especially thinking about the 2022 session with the infighting over the redistricting maps that had Senate going in memorably in on a Saturday. It took until the day before session ended to pass that map, where the Senate immediately adjourned, which left the House kind of scrambling the last day. And I think any hope that the session was going to be quote unquote different this year was almost killed immediately, because it was literally within that first month, looking back on, my coverage, it was in that first month that Senate President Pro Tem Caleb Rowden stripped some members of the Freedom Caucus of their committee chairmanships and parking spots because they were holding up appointments by Governor Mike Parson and doing a lot of delays. And so I don't know what else Plocher would have thought maybe would have happened in the session. Also, I guess that's kind of my question, kind of a question back to him of how he thought it might have been different.
I don't know. Maybe he wished he could wave his House Speaker magic wand and sprinkle a little House fairy dust on the Senate and make them get along. But that isn't what happened, because you mentioned the ongoing conflict between most of Senate Republicans and this renegade faction known as the Freedom Caucus. You just mentioned that it started at the beginning of the session. Why do you think it festered throughout the 5 months that the General Assembly was gavelled in?
It began almost immediately because members of the Freedom Caucus did not want to wait until the last week of session to pass this resolution that we are going to talk about at length that would have made it harder to amend the state constitution. They wanted it done quickly. And, spoiler alert, what did we spend the last week on was on that. So they weren't really off base that this might have taken until the end of session. They didn't want that to happen. They wanted it done quickly. And pretty much immediately there was interruptions of businesses on the Senate floor. Like I said, there was a holdup of 25 gubernatorial appointments. That was a filibuster of over 8 hours. It led to the stripping of those committee chairmanships. And Rowden, to quote him, pretty much the beginning of the 2024 legislative session in the Senate has been nothing short of embarrassment, is what he said as he made that announcement. So, it's all kind of stemmed from that.
Well, let's talk about the big showdown in the Missouri Senate. And in some respects, this showdown between the two GOP factions what came to a head the last week over the measure that raised the bar to amend the state constitution. Some Freedom Caucus members wanted to shut off a Democratic filibuster by force, but there were not enough Republicans to go along with that move. Here's Senate President Pro Tem Caleb Rowden talking about that decision.
I literally am walking out of here as a guy that has basically accomplished everything I wanted to accomplish, and I did it in a way that was, respectful and collegial, and I try to do my very best to help folks that, disagreed with me on certain issues, both on my side of the aisle and the others. So you can have relationships, you can disagree respectfully, and you can understand that on most days, you're not going to get 100% of what you want.
That is Senate President Pro Tem Caleb Rowden reflecting on the decision not to use a motion known as the previous question, which cuts off a filibuster in the last week of session. Sarah, what do you make of Rowden's comments there?
I think that, the perception of the building between the House and the Senate is seen as the slower, more deliberative chamber. In the House, you only have 15 minutes to speak on a bill. Debate gets cut off all of the time in that previous question motion. That's not in the case for the Senate, in the Senate where a single senator can stand up and kill a bill if they feel like it. But the filibuster also forces a compromise a lot of the time. The legislature passed, I think, Rowden spoke about priorities. I think a big one for him was this really big education bill that they passed that initially started off as only an expansion of the state's tax credit scholarship program that ultimately included teacher pay raises and changing how the foundation formula, how they fund schools, is going to factor enrollment, not just attendance. And I think that, that started out as just this expansion, but it ended up with things that Senate Democrats ultimately won, so they sat down. So it's a more collaborative body. early. And so ending the debate, forcing a vote on issue is really seen as the nuclear option and really sours relationships in the chamber. And maybe you can correct me, Jason, but what I think the special session, before I got to this position, there was a PQ issued, and Senate Democrats were still angry about that at the beginning of the 2022 session. Like, correct me if I'm wrong in that. So
I think you're correct. Yeah, I think you're correct, and you were correct that when the PQ is used, it causes longer term damage to Senate relationships than just at that very moment, basically.
And so at that point, there could be a situation where, another bill happens, but because this PQ happened, previous questions in the Senate are pretty much known for just killing sessions. If they had done a PQ earlier in the year, Senate Democrats would have filibustered every single thing. And so relationships ultimately are built in that, and that's a huge betrayal of trust, which I think is why ultimately that's why it didn't happen.
So let's talk about the Senate Democrats. Democratic Senate Minority Leader John Rizzo of Independence said the demise of the bid to make the Constitution harder to amend, or what supporters call IP reform, is a win not just for his party, but for Senate norms. Here is Senator Rizzo right now.
I don't think that this body wanted to give certain people in that chamber a win in the throes of session after the way they were treated all year. And I truly am. I'm proud of all the Democrats and Republicans that stood up to that, truthfully. But I don't think these last few days were about IP at all. I obviously feel like that is clear priority for them. And like I said, I think it comes back. And it might come back with a vengeance, honestly. But I think this week was about enough was enough.
That was Senate Minority Leader John Rizzo, an Independence Democrat. In addition to kind of responding to Rizzo's comments, what do you think about the past week showed about Missouri Senate Democrats?
I think it says a lot about where Missouri Senate Democrats decided to draw the line this year. I'm going to go back to that education bill. That was one they didn't like, and even House Democrats, at first, but sat down and let the bill go through. House Democrats had a lot that they didn't like about it, especially Boone County Democrats, because it does allow for charter schools in Boone County. And there were questions of why didn't the Senate Democrats filibuster longer on that. There was also the filibuster led by Senate Democrats on this year over a bill that bars public funds like Medicaid reimbursements from going to abortion providers or their affiliates like Planned Parenthood. And eventually Democrats let that bill through. And Senate Minority Leader John Rizzo has said that Republicans can pretty much put on the gas anytime they want with issues. So to me, this showed that Democrats really picked their battle in this one issue. It was either strip the other provisions off of this or it dies. And the fact that the Senate had already passed a clean version of this with just the voting threshold increase showed that, some Republican senators were already okay with that option in the first place. So I think it was really showing how Senate Democrats knew how to choose their battle in this case.
And just to piggyback on what you just said, the big dispute between the Missouri House and the Missouri Senate and within the Missouri Republican caucus was whether to include those other provisions on what they call IP reform. And that includes like a ban on non-citizens from voting, which is already illegal in Missouri. Mm-hmm. And I think that the idea was that it would make it easier to pass since straight up constitutional threshold increases have failed in Arkansas and Ohio. Why do you think that there was such disagreement over that particular point of adding other provisions?
I mean, I think that's what Senate Democrats called it a fair fight, and like they are okay with voting on that provision, but they didn't want anything to undermine what the original intent is of that. And I think that I think we talked about Plucker being disappointed in this and that it didn't pass, but ultimately, I just want to make it clear the House could have passed this months ago. It was sent over in the Senate without any other additional provisions, and they added that back on. So I don't think it's even quite fair to really blame one chamber here on that situation, because it could be on its way to the ballot right now if it wasn't for that language getting back on. So I think that was a big disagreement. And ultimately, I think that Republicans would have voted for that language. I think most, that additional language, but there just wasn't a path through the Senate that way.
We're talking with St. Louis Public Radio's Sarah Kellogg about the 2024 legislative session, which ended on Friday. When it was clear that any effort to boost the threshold to amend the state constitution was not going to pass, GOP tensions just exploded in the Senate chamber. Here's Senator Rick Bratton of Harrisonville, the leader of the Freedom Caucus, from last Wednesday.
And I know the people are listening to this online and are fed up with the Republican Party because they have no backbone. And they will have the blood of the innocent on their heads. Shame on this party.
That is Senator Rick Bratton of Harrisonville, who is also the head of the Missouri Freedom Caucus. Sarah, when Bratton is talking about the blood of innocents, I think he's clearly talking about a proposed ballot item legalizing abortion in the state. How did that play into the debate over raising the constitutional amendment threshold?
These two issues have been tied together since the end of last year's session, where House Speaker Dean Plocher said if abortion were to become legal, it would be because of the Senate's inaction, because that year in particular, House sent something over only for the Senate to not get far. Like the Senate did not, so that was his comments on that. And he placed the blame on them this year as well. The ballot item that would have legalized abortion was brought up, honestly, all the time this year by both parties. Sometimes Republicans would bring it up as a reason why this, I will call it IP. I know it's, this motion.
I don't like calling
motion
it
to make
IP.
it hard to amend the Constitution.
I don't like
it's
calling
going to save us some time.
I don't like calling it IP reform either, but I only used it because the Senator Rizzo mentioned the term IP, but continue.
Yeah, it's going to be easier to say. So they brought up, that was the reason why they brought IP needed to pass. And then, if Republicans weren't bringing it up, then Democrats were bringing it up, saying that's why Republicans wanted to pass IP. And so in case the Republicans didn't bring it up. So, no one was mentioning sports betting in this. This is the reason why I think IP was at the top of the list for pass for so many Republicans this year. And one of the reasons why Democrats wanted to kill it.
What's interesting is some Republicans like Rowden were saying that the entire reason why people like Bratton were bringing it up, which is because they wanted the constitutional threshold boost to be in August, have it passed, and then the abortion initiative, which likely has enough signatures to go on in November, would have needed 5 congressional districts out of 8 to pass. But Rowden has said it's not even a sure thing that the November ballot initiatives would need that higher threshold, because there would almost be a legal fight over that. Can you kind of elaborate on that point?
I mean, a little bit. I think it is a question that it just was an unknown of where the placement would be. They're playing with a lot of if variables, but I think, that is the fact that there was this possible scenario where an initiative petition would have gone on August and could have impacted November. That's obviously a better chance than it going on in November and not impacting, anything going on there. So I think that is the fact that there was this possibility was what was driving it to be done this year, just so they could have that potential of it impacting it.
There's some belief, frankly, from both of Missouri's political parties that this potential November ballot item to legalize abortion could transform Missouri legislative politics. And here's Democratic House Minority Leader Crystal Quaid of Springfield talking about that possibility last week.
This is something that Missourians want because they're tired of Republican overreach. They're tired of politicians in their doctor's offices telling them how to live their lives. And Republican, Democrat, or Libertarian, people don't want government telling them what to do. And so we know that folks are going to show up for this. What it does to what happens in this building, we're going to break the Republican supermajority in the state, House, and Senate this election cycle. Period. And so what that means is that when we have a Democratic governor, we can veto some of this nonsense, some of this, we can uphold that, and more importantly, we can actually work as a larger body to pass these bipartisan things that we've been talking about, like access to childcare, improving our rural hospital access and affordability, all of the desperate things that we need to be looking at, teacher pay, employee pay, all of those things, and having abortion on the ballot is going to let us get that done.
That is House Minority Leader Crystal Quaid, a Democrat from Springfield and also one of 2 major candidates for governor. Sarah, what do you think about Quaid's belief that the abortion ballot initiative could change the legislature's operations?
I think asking to protect the legislature is dangerous, Jason. But
it is very dangerous, but I'm doing it anyways.
I know. Well, so I will say I do know that the last few sessions I've covered, a talking point from Republicans a lot is, well, Missourians are sending supermajorities to Jefferson City. Therefore, they are in agreement with what we are passing. So then what happens if it's no longer a supermajority? I'm not sure what will change exactly, but I do know that that talking point will go away if Democrats do manage to make those gains and no longer be in a superminority. And correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's only 3 seats that need to flip in the House, and Democrats, House Democrats in the Missouri legislature outperformed 2 years ago and were able to flip some seats that I don't think people saw coming. And I think in the Senate they need to flip 2. I think one of those is a guarantee with Boone County, since it is no longer Boone and Cooper County. So I think that will, and so far no one else has signed up to run except for Senate candidate Stephen Weber, and so right now it is literally his to lose. So there's a flip there. So I have to figure out where that other one is, but I don't think it's impossible, and I think it'll be really interesting to see if the tone changes at all. If so.
We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll answer your questions about the 2024 legislative session. Give us a call at 314-382-TALK. That's 314-382-8255. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum with St. Louis Public Radio's Statehouse and politics reporter Sarah Kellogg. And we know that you may not follow the Missouri General Assembly's every twist and turn, so that's why St. Louis Public Radio put out a request for questions about what you want to know about the legislative session. And if you have a question or comment, give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Or send us a tweet at STL on air or an email at talk@stlpr.org. Okay, Sarah, we got plenty of good queries, including this one from Patrick McKelvey on Twitter. I have the easiest question. How many things actually passed? And I can answer that. The answer is 28 non-budget bills, which is lower than the 2022 pandemic. Sarah, what does this lack of productivity say about this session?
I think you mean 2020 pandemic, but I think it says that this dysfunction pretty much ruled in the Senate this year and held up a lot of bills. But also, I want to bring up this point that I haven't talked about, which was this year there was definitely a push from Senator Mike Moon for the Senate to really cut down on what we call like big omnibus bills that contain a lot of measures. He was really advocating for bills to be single issue because he was worried that these big bills would be determined, be ruled unconstitutional. And to his credit, he pointed out to a bill that was thrown out by the state Supreme Court recently because they said it violated the Constitution for having too many subjects. So would stuff have passed anyway, even without the filibuster and the dysfunction? I don't know, because he was really hammering that point home this the last couple weeks.
Greetings ADM asks on Reddit, what happened to the restrictions on ranked choice voting? Did those pass? What kind of restriction also would apply to St. Louis City's approval voting method? Sarah, this passed on the last day of session. What could you tell us about that?
So this did pass. I will say it's a proposed constitutional amendment from the legislature. And if passed by voters, it would eliminate ranked choice voting in the state. It also contains other provisions, but I do want to note that it would not apply to St. Louis. The House version pretty much was a blanket, but when it passed through the Senate, there was a carve out for St. Louis. And as you said, I've written about it. You can find more on our website, but it would not impact St. Louis at all.
We got a lot of questions about the fight around quote unquote IP reform, which Sarah and I have already said we don't like that phrase, but we're just going to use it anyways because why not? Cody Henry on Instagram asks, why would you ever want to change the Constitution? It should be next to impossible to change. Why do you think, Sarah, there have been so many attempts to alter the Missouri Constitution?
All right, so Jason, I might need your help because this is going back when I was in high school, but this is my assumption. So back in 2010, Missouri voters approved of a statute change. So a change to state law, not the Constitution, known as the Missouri Dog Breeding Regulation Act, which created new laws for dog breeders, capped how many dogs they could breed, required resting periods between breeding, other measures. And the very next session, lawmakers went in and they passed a law that stripped out a lot of that. It pretty much made it moot. So there was anger over that. Why change the statute if the legislature is just going to turn around and change it right back? And through the initiative petition process, statute changes require 5% of voters in 6 of Missouri's 8 districts, whereas constitutional changes take 7%. And the legislature can't pass a bill to amend the Constitution. And so, that brings up, percentages and 2% more, you're going to have something that can't be retconned, basically. And I also want to bring out the point that lawmakers can propose constitutional amendments too. It's not just, citizens that are doing that. And I want to be very clear. I looked up a random year and there have been years for sure that IP has been more prevalent and citizens of doing it. But I brought up the year 2024. I looked up the year 2014. That year in August, 5 constitutional amendments were on the August ballot. All were proposed by the legislature, and 4 were on the November ballot, and 3 were by the legislature, and 1 by the people. And so I want to make it clear that it's not just, citizens that are bringing this. This is also by the legislature.
Brilliant on Twitter asks, why did the House send back IP reform with ballot candy when it seemed impossible after the 50-hour filibuster? So, Sarah, this would require us to read the hearts and minds of House leadership, but do you have any theories on why they did that, which effectively killed off any chance of voters voting on a constitutional threshold boost?
I mean, as you heard me say earlier in the show, that's a question I've been asking myself, because this issue could have already been on the ballot had they not decided to add that back in. I mean, I think it's not, you can't rule out the thought that they didn't think that this was popular. This issue has failed in Arkansas, which is not, a Democratic utopia. It is not passed in, it failed in Ohio too, which is a little more purple, but still, these issues I think were seen as unpopular, and maybe these particular provisions would have made it more appealing. I don't know. I think that maybe they wanted a more guaranteed thing. You're right. It's asking to read minds, but it is a question I have, because it could have been done. It could have been done months ago.
Now, by the way, when we hear ballot candy in a question, ballot candy is the term that either detractors of the constitutional threshold boost or frankly, some of the proponents have used to describe the other provisions. And I think it's worth noting to everybody that ballot candy has been used a lot by both right-leaning groups and left-leaning groups. It's been brought up that the 2018 Clean Missouri Initiative, which everybody knew was about redistricting, state legislative redistricting, had like lobbyist gift ban and some very minor campaign finance changes, and also allowing sunshine requests for legislative emails. So it's been done on both sides of the political spectrum. But I think what was most notable, Sarah, about this was I don't even think the proponents of the ballot candy were even really trying to hide what they were trying to do here. And that's why I think that people found it arguably distasteful. What would you say to that?
There was if I remember the debates, because there's been so many, there was a lot of pivoting of questions of why is this on there? And there was a lot of non-answers from Republicans on that, other than saying yeah, we do think it should be only citizens should vote on. And also, to be clear, this was citizens voting on constitutional amendments. It wasn't even citizens, non-citizens shouldn't vote. It was specifically on constitutional amendments. And I think there was a lot of well, I do think that should be the case, but also our Constitution is sacred and we should not have as many amendments to it. So I think there was also just the focus was all on what they were trying to do, and the fact that they didn't mention this language as much really shows that the intent was that higher voter threshold.
So one of my favorite Twitter accounts, Missouri Mapper, has this observation that I'd like you to respond to. I wonder if this means that IP reform may be effectively dead for future sessions as well. If the abortion vote passes in November, I imagine some Republicans skeptical of IP reform will argue that passing IP reform will make it harder to repeal the abortion amendment, and thus there may not be any action on IP reform until the GOP manages to repeal the abortion amendment or replace it with something else, which may take years, decades, or may just never happen. Sarah, what do you think of our friend Missouri Mapper's observation there?
I think that's a very astute observation, and I think I think that's a good point. I think November might decide whether or not IP is brought up again.
So for the last question, I want to bring up this question from the unverified Tom Radamowski. I'm sorry if I got that name wrong, on X. A number of journalists have said that the way this session ended could herald a major turning point in the Missouri legislature. What makes people think that this is a sign of change versus a hiccup in GOP legislative ability? Sarah, I'll have you answer first, and then I'll give my parting thoughts.
Yeah, I think next year is really going to be a big indication of how the Senate works. Because of term limits, there were some pretty prominent people within the Freedom Caucus that are getting termed out. That includes Senators Bill Eigel, Denny Hoskins, and Andrew Koenig. Those are big leadership, and they were pretty, head, not like I know the head of the party or on that wing is Senator Bratton, but those three members were big, big players within that within the caucus. And I think that what happens next with this new group of people, new senators, if more people join, I think that's going to really be an indication of if this was just a hiccup or this is something that might be more long term.
My feeling is that if the November election results show significant legislative losses in suburban districts in particular, I'm talking like St. Louis County, St. Charles County, Jackson County, I don't know if it will cause the Republicans to maybe moderate their policy making, but if they don't have the supermajority anymore and Democrats become even more impactful in the legislative process, perhaps this past session and also the passage of a bill that banned most abortions could require some introspection when it comes to tactics and legislative decision making. But we can't predict what the legislature is going to do, so we'll just have to find out in 2025. Sarah Kellogg is St. Louis Public Radio Statehouse and Politics reporter. Sarah, thank you for joining us.
You got it. Thanks, Jason.
Today's episode was produced by Jason Rosenbaum.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer. St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on The Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.